This is the Heroes for Freedom podcast. I'm Rick Robison. Sergeant Alvin York. This is the Christian who fought like a lion. Quote, "A true warrior fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him." That's a quote from G.K. Chesterton. Corporal Alvin York could see his friends dropping all around him. In fact, the Germans had several well-placed machine gun nests set back into the hill above them. It was raining death upon the newly arriving Americans. This was the massive Battle of Meuse-Argonne in the fall of 1918. The bloodiest battle of the war for these American doughboys, in fact. With his officers down and dying and their sergeant dead, Corporal Alvin York knew what he had to do. He didn't want to kill the enemy, for it flew in the face of his beliefs, but he would not allow one more of his men to die. He grabbed his rifle, which was an Enfield 30-06 bolt action, and had a .45 Colt M1911 pistol strapped to his belt. Alvin flanked the machine gun nests, and then, using his exceptional marksman skills and from cover, he began to pick off one enemy soldier after another with his rifle. At that point, the Germans spotted Alvin, and a group of them, 6 in fact, rushed at him with their bayonets glistening in the sun. This is the fighting conscientious objector. And this story of our noble and great ones, this one particularly, is found in the Heroes for Freedom manual series in full color. There are links in the show notes are contained below. These are great for homeschoolers, of course, parents, grandparents, to instill in their children these short but amazing stories that are no longer being taught in our schools and universities. Stories that will entertain, and I think, but more importantly, they'll inspire. In today's hyper-feminized America, the ideal male role model has changed considerably, I think, from what was expected of a man when Alvin York was growing up in the mountains of Tennessee. Fortunately for America, I think, and the world, both World Wars I and II, in these wars, men were expected to stand heroically against the enemy and to defeat evil. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died. During the lifetime of Alvin York, which was about 100 years ago, the blood of the American male, according to recent studies, was flush with testosterone, far beyond, in fact, what's found in today's male population. There's several good studies on this. I'll include some in the show notes. And Alvin, as a young man, he felt his wild oats. He did. He'd been a brawler, a scrapper, and a rabble-rouser. He drank too much, and he had this powerful religious feeling all of a sudden one day that swept him, that changed his life for the better. Now, the world had always been hard on Alvin, but, he didn't really know it, in fact. That was just life to him, life in the mountains. But because he had to, Alvin became one of the finest shots, in fact, with a rifle in Tennessee. His deceased father left him this old Kentucky long rifle. It was a muzzle loader, an ancient weapon, but it was highly accurate. After his father died, it was Alvin's job to supply meat for the family: turkey, deer, wild boar, squirrels, and rabbits. He needed to provide this to his mother, for his mother and his siblings. He had 10, in fact, big family. This ancient rifle was a single shot. And of course, what that meant when he hunted is he usually only got one shot. Powder and ball was expensive, and so he made each shot count. Alvin was also an American patriot. He did not want other Americans, to go off and fight in his stead while he stayed safely at home. He wanted, at the time, he was in his 20s, to marry his sweetheart, Gracie Loretta Williams, and then to build a home. He loved her, but he felt guilty that he was stealing her away from the security of her father and family to take up with a young Noah Count who had nothing. He had nothing but dreams to live on. In the early 1900s in the Tennessee mountains, it was practically impossible for an unlearned young man to work his way out of poverty. I mean, he could work till dawn, till dark. He would just never really get ahead. Schools were poor, and they were far between. Alvin, in fact, had less than a year of formal education. But then came the winds of war. In 1917, Alvin was drafted into the Army. He was shipped off to Camp Gordon in Georgia, in fact, for training. And it's incidentally, this same Camp Gordon, is where I was born. Soon he was on his way to Europe, and he was assigned to the U.S. Army's 82nd Infantry Division. You may recognize this. The 82nd later is transitioned to the famous 82nd Airborne Division during World War II. Though prepared for war, Alvin York was still reluctant to shed the blood of the enemy, but his platoon was sent into the Meuse-Argonne battle. This was one of the bloodiest of the war for the Americans. They had come in late in the war, in World War I. They were sent there to confront a German unit nearby, but they were given faulty maps. In fact, the maps were in French. And they got confused a little bit, and all of a sudden, too late, they found that they were surrounded by a large enemy force. The Germans attacked them. York's platoon commander was killed. Many of the men were wounded or killed, and this German machine guns nearby were massacring his friends and comrades. Alvin knew what he had to do to end the fighting, and he wanted to end it as quickly as possible. What happened next, however, left his commanding officers amazed, and his fellow soldiers, of course, very grateful. With the help of several other brave men from his platoon, York crawled towards the enemy. They flanked him. They outflanked the enemy position on the hill above them. And from a somewhat concealed position, York was close enough, he fired on the German machine gunners and the soldiers that were supporting these machine gun nests. And he dropped one enemy combatant after another. One shot, one kill, exceptional marksmanship and efficiency. Then 6 German soldiers came up, and they spotted him, and they rushed at him with their bayonets. His rifle was now empty at that point. He'd used up his ammo. Alvin coolly pulled out his .45 Colt pistol, and one at a time he shot the enemy as they came at him, bayonets before them. Confused at what was happening and seeing his soldiers dropping around him, the German officer who was in charge of that hill, thinking they were facing a much larger force of Americans, in fact, told the rest of his men to surrender, to throw up their hands and give up. The battle was over, and there were 25 German troopers laying dead on this mountain, on this hill, around these machine guns. And about 130 men surrendered and were captured by York, backed up, of course, by 9 of his men. York had boldly placed himself in harm's way to protect his buddies and to help stop the fighting. It was an act of bravery, in fact, so astonishing that when his superiors first heard of the report, no one believed it. They had to do an investigation, and they finally confirmed that, indeed, this had been a heroic and historic event. Though Sergeant York never claimed to have acted alone, media reports gave him, in fact, the lion's share of the credit. And I think he deserved it, but it was not what he wanted. The U.S. government brought him home to a ticker tape parade in New York City. It just about overwhelmed him. He was awarded the key to the city, and several major companies, American companies, came to him, wanted him to give him a lot of money to endorse their products. But Sergeant York refused. He said no, to profit from his service to his country was not what he wanted. He repeatedly petitioned the government, in fact, to let him go home. The war was over. But before he could leave, the Army insisted on awarding him the Medal of Honor. He received other medals, including the French Croix de Guerre and the Italian War Merit Cross. Arriving home, he found his sweetheart, Gracie Williams, waiting for him. He'd promised her, in fact, that he would give her his hand if he did somehow survive the war. And then a big surprise came. The American Rotary Club there in Tennessee presented York and his bride a new house on their very own Tennessee farm, something Alvin had worked hard all his life to afford, but he never could quite make enough money. But now he had his own place, and he was there with his sweetheart by his side. He had never traveled more than 50 miles from the place he was born when he had gone off to war. But once seeing the modern cities of the eastern states, York became convinced that the reason that there was so much poverty around him, this was why the kids were struggling. They needed educational opportunities. So he established the Alvin C. York Agricultural Institute, a school specially designed to give young people in rural Tennessee access to education. Later, when World War II was heating up in Europe, Alvin became convinced Adolf Hitler's Germany needed to be stopped, and that the war was the only solution. War and fighting was the only solution to end this terrible evil. Immediately, he began to encourage leaders, wrote letters, and talked to many, to prepare America for the war that he was convinced was coming. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Alvin York tried to re-enlist. He was rejected due to his age and his health, which wasn't too good at the time. So he worked with the Army to sell war bonds. He supported the war effort any way that he could. He had a stroke in the mid-1950s, and his health continued to slowly deteriorate. He died on September 2nd, 1964, in the Nashville Veterans Hospital. He's buried today in the Wolf River Cemetery at Pall Mall, Tennessee. So why do we honor Sergeant York? Well, this young man was an American hero for several reasons, and then later in his life as well. First, he came from nothing With little education, little economic and social opportunity, he was highly disadvantaged, yet struggling just to put food on the table. But this would never stop him. Second, he determined to do something about this widespread poverty he could see all around him. And he raised funds nationally to provide the children of his poor neighborhoods with better educational opportunities. As I mentioned, he established the Alvin York Agricultural Institute, helping the disadvantaged youth that he knew and that he would meet. Third, though believing that killing was against the teachings of Christ, he came to understand that sometimes a man must do battle to preserve his faith, freedom, home, and family. He embraced the divine principle that a true warrior fights to protect those he loves, as well as the innocent and the helpless. And lastly, Sergeant York believed passionately that a soldier should never profit financially from the service to his country. American warriors are never plunderers or exploiters, either during war or after. However, if a warrior can use the story of his past service to inspire others to do good and to strengthen the nation, then I think he felt that was okay. Sergeant York had a warrior creed, and I think this is why Americans are natural heroes in so many ways. Sergeant Alvin York demonstrated why we fight. Americans are effective at making war and always have been because of the righteous warrior liberates men in bondage. That's why you go to war. They protect the innocent, women and children, the elderly, those who are struggling and in harm's way. The proclamation on the family, you can look that up, explains this perfectly. And Sergeant York honored the sanctity of life, which is God-given, and he did this through his own heroic actions. America's gift to the world, I think through many past conflicts, has always been to confront and defeat despotism and evil. Americans refuse to fight to enrich themselves or to control and exploit other peoples. Alvin York understood these principles. When we fight, we do it without hatred, which corrupts the soul. We fight ferociously to overwhelm the enemy on the field of battle in order to end the war and to go home. And when we've not done this in the past, you look at history, bad things tend to happen. In Alvin York's own words, he said, quote, "I did what I had to do to save lives. I have no hatred in my heart," unquote. The true warrior fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. I'm Rick Robison, and this is the Heroes for Freedom podcast.